Have you ever typed a message asking for help, then erased it before sending? Have you ever needed someone, but told yourself, "It is fine. I will figure it out alone"? From the outside, people see you as independent, thoughtful, someone who never asks for too much. But inside, every request feels heavy. Every need feels like a risk. Not because you do not trust people, but because you are afraid of becoming a burden. This video is not about weakness. It is about the quiet fear of taking up space, the fear of asking, and the psychology behind why some people would rather struggle silently than feel like they are too much. People who are afraid of being a burden are often misunderstood. They are described as too quiet, too reserved, or too self-contained. Some call them overly polite. Others assume they are simply strong, independent, and emotionally mature. And on the surface, that description seems accurate. They rarely ask for help. They apologize even when nothing is wrong. They handle things on their own and say they are fine, even when they are not. But here is the part most people miss. This behavior is not about confidence, and it is not about strength in the way society usually defines it. It is about fear, a very specific fear. The fear of taking up too much space, the fear of being inconvenient, the fear that their needs, emotions, or presence might become a problem for someone else. Many people believe that being afraid of being a burden means you do not value yourself. But that is not entirely true. In many cases, it means you learned very early that asking for too much came with consequences. That needing help changed how people treated you. That love, attention, or safety felt conditional. So instead of risking rejection, you adapted. You learned to need less. You learned to stay quiet. You learned to carry everything on your own. And today, that adaptation still runs in the background of your mind. In this video, we are breaking down the psychology of people who are afraid of being a burden, where this fear comes from, how it shapes your behavior without you realizing it, and how it slowly affects your relationships, your energy, and your sense of self. Because this is not a personality flaw, it is a survival strategy. Let us start by clearing something important up. People who are afraid of being a burden did not wake up one day and decide to feel this way. This fear was not chosen. It was learned. In most cases, it formed quietly, long before the person had words for it. Often, it begins in childhood, in environments where emotional needs were treated as inconvenient, excessive, or disruptive. Not necessarily abusive, not always dramatic. Sometimes it was subtle enough that no one else noticed. A sigh when you asked for help, a change in tone when you needed attention, a comment like, "not now," that never turned into later. Over time, your nervous system started connecting patterns. Needing too much leads to tension. Asking questions leads to annoyance. Expressing emotions leads to distance. And the brain, especially a young one, is excellent at adapting. You learned that being low maintenance kept the peace. You learned that staying quiet made things smoother. You learned that handling things yourself made you safer. So you adjusted. You stopped asking unless it was absolutely necessary. You learned to read the room before speaking. You became good at sensing when someone was tired, stressed, or unavailable, and you backed away before they had to say anything. At the time, this adaptation worked. It protected you from rejection. It minimized conflict. It helped you stay connected in environments where connection felt fragile. The problem is that the brain does not update these rules automatically. What kept you safe, then quietly, followed you into adulthood. Another common origin is early responsibility. Many people who fear being a burden grew up having to be the strong one, the reliable one, the child who did not cause trouble, the one who was praised for being mature, understanding, or independent. They learned that being easy made them lovable, so they internalized a dangerous belief. My value comes from how little I need. And once that belief takes root, it shapes everything. You do not ask for help because you do not want to disappoint. You do not share struggles because you do not want to worry anyone. You do not express needs because you believe they are already too much. There is also another layer that is often overlooked. Some people learn this fear not from neglect, but from inconsistency. Love and attention were available, but unpredictable. Sometimes support was there. Sometimes it vanished. Sometimes asking was welcomed. Other times it was met with silence or withdrawal. This teaches the brain something very specific. Connection is unstable. Needing too much risks losing it. So instead of risking that loss, you minimize your needs. You learn to become emotionally efficient. You give more than you take. You show up for others while quietly disappearing when it is your turn. And again, this is not weakness. This is intelligence. Your nervous system did exactly what it was designed to do. It observed what caused pain and learned how to avoid it. The fear of being a burden is not about low self-worth at its core. It is about safety. It is about maintaining connection in a world that once made connection feel conditional. And here is where it gets even more complicated. As you grow older, this pattern often gets reinforced. People praise you for being independent. They admire how you never ask for anything. They call you strong, calm, easy to be around. And each compliment quietly confirms the rule your brain learned long ago. I am valued because I do not need much. But no one tells you the cost of that rule. No one warns you that constantly shrinking your needs teaches your nervous system that your needs are dangerous. No one explains that being easy to be around is not the same as being deeply known. So the fear remains invisible, even to you. You might not consciously think, I am afraid of being a burden. Instead, it shows up as hesitation, as overthinking, as that familiar pause before asking for help. It shows up when you feel guilty for resting, when you apologize for sharing feelings, when you convince yourself that others have it worse. And because this pattern develops slowly, it feels normal. It feels like your personality. But it is not who you are. It is who you became in order to stay connected. So the question is not why you are like this. The real question is this. If your fear of being a burden once protected you, what is it costing you now? By the time this fear reaches adulthood, it no longer feels like fear. It feels like logic. It feels like courtesy. It feels like being a good person. This is what makes it so difficult to notice. On the surface, the behavior looks reasonable, even admirable. You do not interrupt people when they seem busy. You hesitate before asking questions. You apologize before speaking, just in case. You tell yourself that everyone else has enough going on. But underneath these small, polite decisions, something deeper is happening. Your brain is constantly scanning for signs of inconvenience. Before you speak, it asks, are they tired? Before you ask for help, it asks, are they stressed? Before you share how you feel, it asks, will this make things heavier? This happens so fast that you barely notice it. The moment a need arises, your nervous system activates a familiar calculation. Is this worth the risk? And most of the time, the answer is no. Not because you do not need support, but because needing support feels dangerous. Psychologically, this fear operates through anticipation rather than reaction. You are not responding to rejection. You are preventing it. So you stop yourself before anyone else has the chance to stop you. This is why people who fear being a burden often struggle to ask for help, even when help is clearly available, even when others have offered, even when the cost of staying silent is exhaustion. Their mind does not say, "I am not allowed to ask." It says, "I should not ask." That difference matters because should feels like responsibility. It feels like maturity. It feels like the right thing to do. Another common behavior is over-explaining and over-apologizing. You apologize for needing clarification. You apologize for taking time. You apologize for emotions that require no apology at all. This is not about politeness. It is about preemptive damage control. By apologizing first, you are trying to soften the impact of your existence. You are trying to reassure the other person that you are aware of the inconvenience and that you are managing it. Even your tone changes. You speak more softly. You add qualifiers. You minimize your needs as you express them. You might say things like, "I am sorry to bother you, but only if it is not too much trouble. It is totally fine if you cannot." And often, before the other person even responds, you pull back. You tell yourself it is okay. You say you will handle it. You convince yourself that asking was unnecessary. This creates a strange contradiction. People who fear being a burden often appear extremely capable. They handle stress well. They manage responsibilities. They rarely complain. So when they do need support, others are often surprised, not because they are unwilling to help, but because they had no idea anything was wrong. But by the time support becomes unavoidable, the person asking is already overwhelmed. This is another key part of the psychology. The fear does not just limit asking. It delays asking until the cost is much higher, which reinforces the belief. See, asking always becomes a big deal. But the reason it becomes a big deal is because it was delayed for so long. There is also a strong internal moral layer to this fear. Many people who are afraid of being a burden tie their self-worth to self-sufficiency. They feel good when they can manage everything alone. They feel guilty when they cannot. Needing help feels like failure. Rest feels undeserved. Support feels like something they have not earned. So they push themselves further. They take on more. They show up when they are drained. They offer help even when they need it themselves. Not because they are selfless, but because helping others feels safer than needing help. Helping does not risk rejection. Needing does. And then there is the emotional side. People with this fear often feel deeply, but express cautiously. They worry that sharing sadness will bring others down. They worry that sharing frustration will create tension. They worry that sharing joy too loudly will take up too much space. So they filter. They show acceptable emotions. They hide inconvenient ones. Over time, this creates emotional loneliness. You may be surrounded by people. You may have relationships, but very few people truly know what you are carrying. And because you are so used to managing on your own, it can be hard to even identify what you need. You know you are tired. You know something feels heavy. But asking for support feels vague, unsafe, and uncomfortable. So you default to silence. This fear also affects boundaries in subtle ways. Because you do not want to inconvenience others, you often tolerate discomfort longer than you should. You say yes when you want to say no. You stay quiet when something hurts. You adapt instead of asking for change. And again, this looks like flexibility, but internally, it creates resentment, fatigue, a quiet sense of being unseen. Not because others are intentionally ignoring you, but because you trained them to. Your nervous system learned that being low maintenance keeps connection intact, so it continues to play that role, even when the cost keeps increasing. And here is the hardest part to accept. The fear of being a burden does not actually protect relationships in the long run. It protects surface harmony, but it prevents depth, because intimacy requires risk. It requires allowing others to see your needs. It requires trusting that your presence is not a problem. And when you never test that trust, the fear never gets corrected. It just keeps running, quietly, automatically, convincingly. So the question becomes not whether this fear makes sense. It does. The question is, what happens when this pattern stays unexamined? What happens to your energy, to your relationships, to your sense of being allowed to exist fully? And that is where the consequences begin to show. At first, this fear seems harmless. It keeps things smooth. It avoids conflict. It makes you appear easy to be around. But over time, the cost begins to surface. The first thing it affects is your energy. When you carry everything alone, exhaustion becomes normal. You learn to function while tired. You learn to push through emotional weight without relief. And because you rarely voice what you need, there is no natural release valve. Stress does not get shared. Feelings do not get processed out loud. They stay inside, stacking quietly. This leads to a specific kind of burnout. Not the dramatic kind that forces a breakdown, but the slow kind that drains joy, motivation, and presence. You might still show up. You might still perform well, but inside, you feel constantly depleted. The second consequence shows up in relationships. From the outside, your connections may look stable. There are no big arguments, no obvious conflicts, but stability without vulnerability is fragile, because people only know the version of you that never needs much. They assume you are okay. They assume you are strong. They assume you will speak up if something is wrong, but you rarely do. So when you feel overwhelmed, unsupported, or unseen, it can feel deeply confusing. You wonder why no one notices, why no one checks in, why no one offers help. What makes this painful is that it feels like rejection, but often it is not rejection. It is invisibility created by self-erasure. When you minimize your needs long enough, people stop looking for them, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. This creates a quiet loneliness that is hard to explain. You may be surrounded by people. You may be loved, but you do not feel held, because being held requires being known. And being known requires allowing your needs to exist. Another long-term effect is resentment, even if you do not want to admit it. You give, you support, you show up, and over time, a small voice starts whispering, "When is it my turn?" But because you rarely ask, that turn never comes. So the resentment turns inward. You blame yourself for feeling tired. You criticize yourself for wanting more. You tell yourself you are being dramatic or ungrateful, instead of recognizing that something essential is missing. This internalized resentment can show up as irritability, withdrawal, or emotional numbness. You stop expecting support. You stop reaching out. You stop sharing, not because you do not care, but because caring without receiving becomes too heavy. There is also an impact on identity. When you build your sense of worth around being low maintenance, you slowly lose access to parts of yourself. You forget what you like asking for. You forget how to rest without guilt. You forget how to express needs without apology. Your identity becomes shaped around accommodation. You become the reliable one, the strong one, the one who does not need much. And while that identity earns praise, It also limits growth, because growth often requires support. It requires being bad at something. It requires leaning, and leaning feels unsafe when you believe your weight is a problem. This fear can also affect how you choose partners and friendships. You may gravitate toward people who need you, people who are expressive, people who take up space easily because their needs feel familiar and your role feels clear. But these dynamics can become unbalanced. You give more than you receive. You adapt more than you are adapted to. You stay longer than you should, not because you are weak, but because leaving feels like causing inconvenience. Asking for change feels like asking for too much, so you stay quiet. And over time, that silence creates distance. Not loud distance, but emotional distance. You start to feel like a background presence in your own relationships. Useful, reliable, but replaceable. This is perhaps the most painful consequence. When you spend years minimizing yourself, it becomes hard to believe that your presence actually matters. Not what you do, not how helpful you are, but simply you. And this belief is not corrected by achievement or praise, because the fear is not about competence. It is about permission. Permission to exist with needs. Permission to take up space. Permission to be held without earning it. When that permission never arrives, even success feels empty. And the longer this pattern continues, the more normal it feels. You might not even recognize it as a problem. You just feel tired, disconnected, quietly lonely. And that is why this fear deserves attention. Not because it makes you fragile, but because it slowly teaches you to disappear. And no one thrives that way. The goal is not to suddenly become someone who asks for everything. That would feel unnatural, unsafe, overwhelming. And that is not what healing looks like here. For people who are afraid of being a burden, change does not come from pushing harder. It comes from redefining what a burden actually is. A burden is something unwanted, something forced, something that harms simply by existing. But a need is not a burden. An emotion is not a burden. Your presence is not a burden. This distinction matters because your nervous system has spent years confusing the two. So the first step is not action. It is awareness, noticing the moment you stop yourself, the pause before asking, the apology that appears automatically. Instead of judging that moment, you observe it. You recognize it as protection, not weakness. Then, change begins in very small, controlled ways. You ask for help with something minor, something low risk. You share a feeling without explaining it away. You let silence exist after expressing a need. And then you watch what actually happens. Most of the time, the reaction is not rejection. It is neutrality, or care, or relief. These moments are important. They slowly teach your nervous system something new. That connection does not collapse when you take up space. That people do not disappear when you express needs. That asking does not automatically create harm. Another part of this shift involves releasing the idea that you must earn support. Support is not a reward for suffering quietly. It is part of being human. You do not need to reach a breaking point to deserve help. You do not need to justify rest. You do not need to apologize for being affected by life. Learning this does not happen intellectually. It happens relationally, through moments where you allow yourself to be seen, even a little, through experiences where someone stays when you expected distance. And yes, not everyone will respond well. Some people are uncomfortable with needs. Some relationships are built on you being the easy one. But that information is not a failure. It is clarity. Because real connection requires mutual accommodation, not one-sided shrinking. Another important part of this path is allowing discomfort. The discomfort of asking, the discomfort of waiting for a response, the discomfort of not fixing things immediately. These sensations are not danger. They are withdrawal symptoms from a pattern that once kept you safe. Your nervous system may react with guilt, anxiety, or second-guessing. That does not mean you did something wrong. It means you are doing something new. Over time, as you practice letting your needs exist, your identity begins to shift. You stop seeing yourself as someone who must be low maintenance to be lovable. You begin to see yourself as someone who is allowed to be held, not constantly, not excessively, but genuinely. And this changes how you relate to others. You choose relationships where space is shared, where effort flows both ways, where you do not have to disappear to stay connected. This does not make you demanding. It makes you present. The fear of being a burden does not vanish overnight, but it does loosen its grip. And in that space, something important happens. You stop surviving connection, and you start experiencing it. If you are afraid of being a burden, there is nothing wrong with you. This fear did not appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by moments where staying quiet felt safer than asking, by experiences where needing less kept connection intact, by a nervous system that learned to protect you by making you smaller. And, for a long time, that strategy worked. It helped you survive emotionally. It helped you stay connected when connection felt fragile. It helped you avoid rejection when rejection felt unbearable. But survival is not the same as living. When you spend years shrinking your needs, you begin to believe that your presence itself is conditional, that love depends on how little you require, that care must be earned through self-denial, and that belief slowly erodes something essential. Not your strength, but your sense of permission. Permission to rest, permission to ask, permission to be held without apology. You are not weak because you have needs. You are not demanding because you want support. You are not a burden because your life affects you. You are human. Learning to take up space does not mean overwhelming others. It means allowing yourself to exist fully, without constant self-editing. And that process does not require becoming someone else. It only requires letting go of the idea that you must disappear to be loved. You do not need to prove your worth by carrying everything alone. You do not need to apologize for your weight in the world. You were never meant to survive quietly. You were meant to be seen. So let me ask you something. Do you recognize yourself in this fear of being a burden? Do you catch yourself holding back, apologizing, or carrying things alone when you do not have to? If this spoke to you, you are not alone. Share your experience in the comments. Sometimes, naming it is the first step toward loosening its grip. And if you want more videos that break down the psychology behind the things you never thought to question about yourself, consider subscribing. The next video might explain something about you that you have felt for years, but never had words for.